Welcome, everybody. I'm Rami Khouri from the American University of Beirut. I head the Global Engagement Initiative from the Deb Center New York office of AUB. And we started this program, which includes now 3 seminars in a row. This is the third seminar. The thing about this effort, which is noteworthy, we believe, is that we bring together scholars and universities and institutions and activists and practitioners from around the world. Today's panel discussion is about water, a case study in what works and what doesn't work in raising awareness and adapting to climate change. The first 2 seminars talked about other issues. They are related to climate change, and the key focus is to discuss these issues from a global perspective, comparative global perspective, and look at what we might be able to do to prod local, national, and global leaderships into real dynamic action, leadership and action. And this is a process that's going to go on for, we hope, some years in different forms. We started with these 3 seminars to really show, and I think we have done it, and you'll see it today, the excitement and the value and the knowledge, the comparative advantage that comes from having people from different cultures and different actions in life, university professors, community activists, maybe officials, when they get together and talk about these issues. So this is all done under the aegis of the Global Coalition for Community Climate Change. That's the name of our effort. It was initiated by Bill Hoffman, who will address us at the end of this seminar. And I just wanted to thank everybody who's been involved in doing this behind the scenes and on screen, especially Dennis Villa in New York, who has handled all the technical work, and Alison Freeland, who has handled much of the communications, and many other people. So I'm going to turn it over to David Morig. David's from the University of Texas at Austin, and he will moderate the session today and introduce the speakers, and we will be in touch again when we continue our efforts to make global engagement a living reality, and hopefully one that has an impact on the collective well-being of all of us and our planet. So thank you again, and I'll turn it over to you, David.
Thank you, and hello everyone. My name is David Morig from the University of Texas at Austin, where I'm a professor of geoscience. Water is one of our most abundant and arguably our most important natural resource. You know, on a personal level, we all benefit immensely from having dependable and safe drinking water. At a societal level, it plays a pivotal role in the production of our food, of our energy, and in commerce. Unfortunately, water is effective at transporting not only manufactured goods, it can move pollutants around both on the surface of the earth and in the subsurface, and an overabundance of water as well as underabundances in water are leading to increasingly more common natural hazards, including flooding, storm surge, and drought. Now, changing climates and changing land use practices and populations are affecting how each one of us are interacting with water, and that is really the motivation for this seminar. Today, we are fortunate to have 4 water experts with us to discuss their work on water resources, on community interactions with water, and to provide some insights into what we might be able to do to promote policy changes that will become necessary in the changing world that we live in. I'm going to give you a sense of who our 4 speakers are now in the order which they will present. The first is Dr. Bridget Scanlon, who is a senior research scientist at the Bureau of Economic Geology at the University of Texas at Austin. She leads its Sustainable Water Resources Program that has a primary objective of assessing water sustainability in the context of climate variability and changes in land use and land cover. We will then hear from Dr. Rob Hope, who is a professor of water policy in the School of Geography and the Environment, as well as the school, as well as the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment at Oxford University. And his research interests are really associated with water policy and the connections with poverty and economics, and has done a great deal of work on the continents of Africa and Asia. Dr. Carol Wilson is an assistant professor of deltaic wetland sedimentology and geomorphology in the Department of Geology and Geophysics at Louisiana State University, and her work centers on the connections between biology, geology, and water, and how they interact to build functioning landscapes, and then how people impact and are impacted by these wetland and deltaic landscapes. And our final speaker will be Dr. Joanna Dumar, who is an assistant professor of hydrogeology in the Department of Geology at American University of Beirut. And her work focuses on methods of monitoring water quality and quantity in areas that tend to be under-instrumented, and with a particular emphasis in Lebanon. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Bridget Scanlon. So take it away, Bridget.
Thank you so much, David. I will try to share my screen. So today I'm going to talk about access to water and energy, and with a focus on Africa. And I would like to acknowledge my collaborators, Ashraf Rateb, Ning Ling, Alex Sun, Michael Young, and Himanshu Save. We know that access to improved water and electricity is represents about 10% of global population. And looking at this map from the World Bank, you can see that most of the lack of access is in sub-Saharan Africa for improved drinking water sources and also electricity. About 50% of sub-Saharan African population does not have access to electricity. So both of these are linked. And I'm following up on what David said. I think, we hear a lot about water scarcity globally, but I prefer to the mantra of too much versus too little. So we're either in a flood or in a drought. And this is from the World Bank blog, where they're talking about the Cape Town drought issues and then flooding issues in other regions. So it's trying to manage these extremes, I think, is the challenge more than global water scarcity. Gave a presentation to the World Bank many years ago and tried to liken sustainable development to bank account, where we have deposits and withdrawals, and we look at how much is in the bank or the storage. And the corollary for that in water resources is recharge to aquifers and discharge to surface water and that connection, and also pumpage for irrigation, and monitoring groundwater levels to assess changes in storage and to determine if we are managing these systems sustainably. We can think of it as a water budget, then input minus output is equal to change in storage. So if we have declining storage in a system, it could be because we have declining inputs to the system related to drought or precipitation, or increasing outputs related to pumpage or irrigation, or both. And so we have to consider climate and human uses and their impacts on sustainability. So we are fortunate to have the GRACE satellites to monitor remotely changes in water storage over large regions globally. And this consists of 2 satellites about 450 kilometers above the Earth, and they continually orbit the Earth. And the first mission was from 2002 to 17, and the second mission in 2018. So by monitoring the distance between the satellites, about 200 kilometers to submicron scale resolution, we produce maps of the Earth's gravity, and then changes in gravity are controlled primarily by changes in water storage. So here I show a map of the major aquifers in Africa and changes in total water storage from the land surface to the deepest aquifer over this 18-year period, 2002 through 2020. So the red areas are declines in storage, and the blue are rises in storage. So over this 18-year period, you can see declines in storage in the aquifers in North Africa, particularly the Nubian aquifer minus 70 cubic kilometers, and the Northwest Sahara minus 60. And then the blue areas, you can see rises in water storage, 20 to up to 130 cubic kilometers in the upper Kalahari. And then the yellow areas are where there's very little change in storage. So what do these trends mean, and what is going on? So we look at time series of total water storage from Grace, and here you can see for the Nubian, we have sort of a gradual decline in storage, and we fit a linear trend, and that's what I was showing with these total depletions. And you can see it's a fairly steady decrease and then sort of leveling out with increased cumulative precipitation towards the end. So this we attribute mostly to irrigation water use in the North African aquifers. So we can look at these trends in all of these systems, and you can see in the north a steady decline in storage in these aquifers, and in West Africa, Senegal and Euromedin, you can see a steady increase in water storage that has been attributed to changing from native vegetation or tiger bush to cropland, reducing root zones and increasing recharge. In the other areas, the upper Kalahari, where we saw a large increase in storage, you can see that this is not a true trend because we don't think it has any predictive skill, but it reflects interannual variability and peaking in 2011 related to climate teleconnections. So most of these other aquifers reflect trends related to interannual variability, and interannual variability, droughts and floods are dominant. And so you can see this here, flooding in May 2020 in much of the region in Africa. So the red areas are flood watch and green are advisory. And then in 2019, you can see soil moisture data in the Horn of Africa indicating drought conditions in this region, Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya. And then this is preceded by flooding in 2018 in the East Africa in the Shabelle River, and then drought conditions in 2015. So just like Texas, where we're either in a drought or a flood, much of Africa is either in a drought or a flood. So how can we manage these conditions? So this is normalized difference vegetation index data from Asaf Anyamba, NASA. So you can see East Africa is generally wet during El Nino, and South Africa is generally dry during El Nino. And Indian Ocean dipole also impacts these conditions. So here you can see El Nino conditions, and you can see 97, 98 was a very strong El Nino, 82, 83, and 15 and 16 was the most recent. I remember taking a taxi in Austin, and the taxi driver was from Kenya, and it was around this period, and he said it was talking about the flooding in Kenya at this period. So we also look at the Indian Ocean dipole, and you can see in orange, very recent, very high Indian Ocean dipole index on the right here, and resulting in flooding in East Africa. And ENSO and the Indian Ocean coincide during these major events, 97, 98, and 82, 83. So these, if we can understand these, maybe we can develop some predictive skill on these wet and dry climate cycles. But because we're a geology department, I want to emphasize we have a very limited understanding of the aquifers in these regions, and new geophysical instrumentation coming from Denmark helps us map these aquifers and understand their properties and the dynamics of storage, how deep they are, and what sort of reservoir. So sort of characterizing what the bank is. And this is very important. A lot of the geology relies on colonial period maps and stuff, so we really need to put a lot of emphasis on geophysics and mapping especially the basement aquifers. So how can we adapt to these climate extremes? One approach is storing water from wet to dry periods, traditionally in surface reservoirs, but more recently we're looking at storing it in depleted aquifers. And they're thinking about that in different regions, and we're using it more and more in the US. We can transport water from humid regions to arid regions, but that's really very energy intensive and expensive. we can conjunctively use surface water and groundwater. And we do this in California and other regions where we have access to both. And here you can see the Orange River and a lot of irrigation along the river. So they're relying on surface water. And if they're pumping groundwater, they're probably capturing base flow to streams. And so we need to consider that also for environmental flows. And in this region, in Southern Africa, Julian Conrad's company, they monitor groundwater levels continuously. And you can see the large center pivots for irrigation. And as long as the water levels remain fairly stable, they maintain the irrigation. But if they start declining, then they ratchet back. So these are some basic approaches to managing wet and dry climate cycles. And we saw this in the Cape Town region, you know, where the demand exceeded supply and the storage was falling off a cliff. And so how did they manage it? So they're looking at increasing supplies, groundwater development, developing new aquifers. Traditionally, they relied on surface water reservoirs almost completely. And now they're looking at groundwater resources, seawater desal. So that's increasing the supply, reducing demand. They shift from irrigation to urban use and also increase irrigation efficiency. They're looking at managed aquifer recharge and then reusing treated municipal wastewater. So I think every region that is facing water scarcity is looking at all of these approaches, increasing supply, reducing demand. So we are starting a consortium at the University of Texas, Access to Water and Energy, because many times it's not the resources that are an issue, it's getting access to them. And I would be glad to answer any questions. Thank you. I stop sharing.
Thank you, Bridget. That was great. And it's exciting to hear about new technologies being used to look at this level of a continent at changes in water availability and quantities. We're going to save most of our questions for the question period at the end of the presentations by all of the panelists, if that's all right. And the next panelist and presenter will be Rob Hope.
Thank you, David. Well, good morning, good afternoon to everybody. Many thanks for joining us today. I'm very excited to be part of this session. I'm going to share some slides as well and hopefully build off some of the comments that Bridget was making earlier, which sort of dovetail with some of the work that I'm going to share here. So if I get this onto full screen for you all, there we go. Yes, I'm going to be talking more at the sort of social level in terms of how people interact with some of the issues that Bridget has raised up in terms of these issues of variability, the extremes that we see in the systems, what this means for people, for vulnerable communities, and how we can think of change that can be made around this. The work I'll draw upon is from ongoing research that we're conducting in coastal Bangladesh and East Africa under the REACH program, and I'll say a word about that at the end. But just two images here. This is the extreme end of the calculus. On the west, on the left-hand side of your screen, you can see Cyclone Amphan that hit coastal Bangladesh and the Bay of Bengal generally sort of late last year, wreaking a lot of devastation. It affected infrastructure, as you can see, including energy and water supplies quite heavily. And then the sort of El Nino effects that Bridget mentioned here. This is in East Africa with the sort of severe flooding that occurred in many of those countries recently. So some of the work we've been trying to think through is, well, what does this mean for people, particularly during the period of COVID, where people are facing sort of the public health crisis that has affected everybody on the planet, and how does climate interact with water use behaviors? So we've been looking with colleagues here in terms of trying to understand what sort of higher rainfall and low rainfall areas have. So if you can see my little marker, this is this sort of high rainfall areas that Bridget alluded to earlier. And the dots relate to kiosks where we have quite detailed daily data on the actual water consumption being taken at those kiosks. And also this is Malawi here, where we have data as well. And what we find, and this is maybe predictable to some degree, and there's wider evidence around it, in rural areas where people have limited and variable income, they're sort of quite careful how they spend money on water, certainly kiosks and improved services. So during wetter seasons, you generally see a reduction. And then in the drier periods, it becomes extremely important. The figure here sort of picks up on the right, on the top right, looks at the payment modalities in terms of how people pay for the water. So on the left side, you can sort of see the wet season in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. And in these areas where people are paying as you fetch, so this is volumetric, if they collect a bucket or a container of water, you sort of see a reduction in usage. But if they pay a monthly fee, a flat monthly fee, non-volumetric, you don't see this reduction. And that has implications certainly for public health and hygiene, where people have increased water demands at this particular moment in time. These are some of the responses that we're thinking about to sort of keep water services working in these areas. So this is quite a regional high-level analysis, and we've done similar types of work in coastal Kenya, looking at community records. So this is with a colleague of mine, Dr. Tim Foster, where we were looking at the actual payment records of communities over quite a long period of time. Tim managed to generate about 50,000 payment records over 200 years of data in total. And the graphic on your left, the sort of takeaway from this is when it rains more revenue is collected. So over a significant period of time, it's quite a clear message that you sort of see these changes in behavior with climate patterns. And this has wider implications as we look at future variability and extremes in many regions of the world, what this will mean for people accessing water and providing services over time. So we've gone down to an even finer grain level of analysis. So Bridget was showing us satellites here. We're doing something sort of quite basic, taking diaries. This is my colleague here, Dr. Sonia Hock, who sort of led this study with me and many other colleagues, trying to understand on a daily basis what happens to people's choice of water sources over a whole year. And we've got two study sites, one in East Africa in Kenya and one in Bangladesh, and I'll say briefly a few words on both. The headline message from this, the bottom plate here, looks at rainfall patterns. So this is higher rainfall that comes in through the short rains towards the end of the year. And what you see here is people then again stop spending money on water. They go to surface water sources, which are generally have concerns possibly on water quality depending where they are, but they change their behaviors quite clearly. And this shows you the types of sources they use. There's sometimes a misconception between some, certainly in global reporting, that people have one main water source. In rural areas, that's often not the case. You can see these many sources of water that people will use across a year. And again, then just highlighting the rainwater, it's very low here until the short rains start kicking in, and then it peaks and you see other sources drop as a consequence of that. So you have this very complex tapestry of behaviors by communities, which are quite closely related to the different climates and the onset and cessation of rainfall events. So shifting to coastal Bangladesh, where we've done similar types of work, same sort of diaries, you see a sort of similar signal here. Obviously, this part of the world is driven by the monsoon cycles, where the rainfall will come through from sort of June through July, August, September, etc. And you see again here different patterns of behavior. But within coastal Bangladesh, you see a different profile in terms of the water choices that people have. These areas commonly have difficulties with salinity in the groundwater, particularly the shallow aquifer systems. And also there are pockets of arsenic in this area as well. It's something that pervades many other areas of Bangladesh as well. So it's not just one hazard, they often have multiple hazards. Elevated areas of manganese as well, which is problematic for a number of reasons. And as a consequence of this, or partly as a consequence of this, vended water, where you will sort of see people delivering water from a less saline source, are quite common. But you also see here this rainwater signal coming through as well. People prefer not to spend money on water given a choice. So this provides a very sort of granular assessment of what's happening, and also the difficulties, particularly during shocks in the system, to keep water services flowing. And this slightly differs from what Bridget was talking about in terms of access to water. The common approach in certainly the global expectations, the global ambition, is to have safe, affordable, reliable water services to people each and every day. The eras of just building infrastructure and leaving it are hopefully behind us to some degree. So it's how do you keep these services running in dry periods as well as wet periods. And so some of the other work that we've been doing is looking at bringing in professional service providers in a number of countries. So this is one that the Oxford group, my colleagues, have been involved in for a number of years. Fundifix. Fundi is Swahili for mechanic. If you bring in a maintenance service, can you get these systems to work, and will users pay for them? So this is partly an emerging solution or an emerging response to this. And we've convened a group under the Uptime Consortium, where we have other partners in different countries in Africa. This over here is Burkina Faso, where Aduma works. We have Water for Good in Central African Republic, colleagues from WAVE in Uganda, and also Water Mission working in both Uganda and Kenya. And all of these social enterprises provide results-based services to communities, and some of them to schools and healthcare facilities as well. So based on the data we have, which has been recently updated, there's about 1 million people being served under this type of model. Users pay roughly 1/3 of the costs, and the uptime, which refers to the functionality of the system, is 94%. Now this relates to a regional average. The best data that we have is around 74–75%, so it's significantly higher. And this is one of the key challenges with the access position, that when the infrastructure is built, it's not maintained. And so the infrastructure, the water supply infrastructure, when it fails, often fails for a month or more. The average is probably around 30 days, but the average disguises some extreme events where people don't have access to water for 2 or 3 months. So Uptime's been trying to sort of look, well, how can we improve this? Is this a way forward to try and think on, contracting at a much higher level of scale? 1 million is not helpful in the African context. 500 million people don't have safe and reliable water today. So it's a huge challenge. Globally, 2 billion people don't have access to safely managed services. So how could we scale this up? So we've started work around this with core partners and looking at a global diagnostic of how this work would go forward, based initially on the reliability of water points, making sure that they're working and functioning, what volume of water they're producing, and then the local revenue in terms of who's going to pay for this. The finance question is a major question. What we find is that users, if you provide a high quality service, will pay some, but not all of the costs. So this is a role for local government and also people to sort of catalyze this approach going forward. So we're in the process of trying to advance this work to help people, particularly with the impacts of climate. So I will conclude here with a few final remarks, which hopefully you can see before you. And if not, you can enjoy the beautiful picture in the background of women having to work very hard on these issues where they don't work well. So the key relationship between rainfall variability and water use behaviors. The policy response is often community-based managed. So rural communities are supposed to absorb or adapt to current and future risks, whether they be climate, health, economic, or political. There's a whole host of these issues that somehow rural communities are always supposed to manage these. Policy action is often to major events, and the daily struggles that we've documented are often unknown, hidden, or ignored. And this is problematic on many levels. And then one of the areas of work that we're involved in with many other colleagues is, can we make service delivery results based to make these more climate resilient into the future? So if you're interested in this work, much of it has come from the REACH program, which is led by the University of Oxford and funded by the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. Please visit the site if you're interested, and I will hand back to David now. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Rob. That was, it's fascinating to see how people make decisions about their drinking water. The next speaker is Carol Wilson, and I'm going to turn the controls over to her.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate this. Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening from where you all happen to be. Here, I think I have this. Let me get this to full screen for everyone. Okay, so excellent. Thanks so much, Bridget and Rob, for setting the stage. It's fascinating to see these different areas. And what I'm going to speak about, I'm also going to talk about the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta in Bangladesh that Rob was just talking about. But I'll also talk about the Mississippi River Delta, which is in my own backyard here in Baton Rouge. And I'm going to be approaching this from a Delta geologist and sedimentologist point of view. So we have a lot of changes that happen to these landscapes. And as Dave was mentioning, that I have a tendency to look at these approaches of what was in the natural system versus where people are living now. So in this image that I'm showing here, we have the Sundarbans, which is a natural mangrove forest in Bangladesh that's been preserved, versus the area that's been poldered where most of the people are living. And you can see there's just drastic changes in deforestation in that region, and obviously using that land then for agriculture and our livelihoods. Let me just move forward. There we go to our next slide. So here in Louisiana and in Bangladesh, and certainly all around the world, people who live close to rivers are prone to this flooding. And I show here two images, one from Louisiana in March 2016, when we had immeasurable floods from a very large precipitation event that happened. But in the background, there's the natural levee, the anthropogenic levee that we've put in place to kind of prevent river water from flooding our houses. But in deltas, we have not only river flooding and overtopping the landscape, but we also have very flat land that it's very hard to drain. So waterlogging is a constant problem. And over here on the right, I show an image from Bangladesh in 2020 during their monsoon season that Rob was just talking about. And Bangladesh is one of these very densely populated areas in the world where, for those familiar with the US, we have about 300 million people. Well, Bangladesh is a country with 150 million people, so it's half the population of the United States, but it's essentially shrunk down to an area of the size of just one state. So extremely densely populated. And I've got a map here to kind of show our population densities around the world. So certainly where people are living, particularly close to rivers and deltas is very important. We are attracted to these areas because they're very productive regions. We can get our livelihoods from these, we can get our food resources and transportation and commercial goods from them, but also realizing that as our population grows, we also are having more and more people then put at risk and close to risk of flooding. So I'm just going to show an image of the Ganges Brahmaputra over in Bangladesh, where if you're not that familiar, we've got two very large river systems that discharge, they come together and they discharge into the Bay of Bengal. And as a delta geomorphologist, I'm really interested in a lot of different aspects like sediment dynamics and elevation dynamics in this delta. And I'm going to show you here, this is a DEM, it's a digital elevation model of the delta, to just show your elevation of delta landscapes, where the warmer colors here are higher in elevation and the cooler colors, blues and purples, are much lower in elevation, so very close to sea level. I mean, you can see most of this landscape is very low lying. Another thing is that it's a tectonically active margin. That's quite fascinating with the river landscape. But in terms of when we think of river dynamics, we look at not only how much water is coming down the rivers, but also the sediment supply. And these two rivers have the largest sediment supply anywhere on Earth. About 1 billion tons of sediment is discharged per year. And when we think about delta dynamics, we think about this balance between the water and the sediment that's being supplied to this region and building a landscape and maintaining that landscape. This river is quite unique in that it is mesotidal, so it's got a very large tidal range. So in deltaic regions, we have risk of flooding from three different, it's like a three-prong approach. You have flooding from the river that could be flooding the landscape. We could have flooding from tides. And so this is showing just essentially the tidal range, are these numbers in yellow here, from 2 meters to 6 meters for a tidal range. And these tides can extend more than 100 kilometers inland. So that is causing a risk to these local communities. And then there's also the storm surge, right, from these coastal areas. So flooding, this map over here on the right is indicating what areas of the Delta are at risk of flooding. So it's a compilation of flood areas from 1999 to 2009. This was compiled by Irina Overeem at the Colorado Flood Observatory. These different colors are essentially showing that in Bangladesh in particular, flooding is very widespread. And a lot of these areas that are very low lying that we were just showing the elevation dynamics get flooded year after year. And then there's also some interannual variability just depending on how much the monsoon precipitation is bringing water down. What is also overlaid on here is subsidence rates. So for those of you that aren't familiar with subsidence, this is a natural phenomenon in deltas. It is the lowering of the land surface that happens, and it's from a myriad of processes like sediment compaction that happens in this area and also sediment loading on the lithospheric plates. You can also have anthropogenic impacts that can exacerbate that. But these yellow arrows are essentially showing the rate of subsidence that Michael Steckler at Columbia University has been measuring with continuously operating GPS. So the length of that line of the arrow, so essentially the point right here, this is Dhaka, the capital city. So the length of that line is quite large compared to some of these others that are quite shorter. And this partly has to do with the natural dynamics that inland areas don't have as thick of sediment coverage, so they're much lower subsidence rates. Areas like the Sylhet Basin, this is a tectonically active area, so that length of that area is quite large. Here in Dhaka, though, this arrow is very large because of groundwater withdrawal that's happening. And essentially, we've got a very large subsidence rate occurring to that region. Now, you'll notice over here in the southern regions of Bangladesh that are more the coastal zone, there's not that many continuously operating GPS. And so Mike Steckler and I are coupling our efforts to measure both the deep subsidence using a GPS network, and then also some of the shallow subsidence numbers. So some of our recent research has just been installing some new instruments in this region. And I just want to bring to light that in order to maintain a certain deltaic landscape, we need to balance what we consider relative sea level rise. So that's our eustatic sea level rise and our subsidence combined. That has to be balanced by new sediment to maintain a subaerial landscape. Otherwise, it's going to drop out and it'll become subaqueous. In the coastal zone, where a lot of Rob's work was just showing us, there have been put in place to help keep out the tides. I mentioned that the tides are quite large. So here's just two tide gauges, one at Huron Point and one in Mangla, a little further inland. So polders are these earthen embankments that were put in place to keep out floodwaters, both the tides and storm surges, and to bolster agricultural production, such as in this figure right here in the lower right. But we know that there's been some impact to the delta landscapes. And I'm just going to show a couple of slides from work that I'm doing with Rip Hale to look at elevation dynamics and sediment delivery to our region. And one just has to do with the Sundarbans, which are our natural mangrove platform. Again, I said this was tidal, so at low tide, the area is subaerial. The land is subaerial, so the Sundarbans can breathe, if you can think about it that way. But during high tide, the water inundates this area and delivers both water and sediment and nutrients to these to help this grow. And I put in here, just for others, that the Bengal tiger is living in this area. It's a beautiful preserve with a myriad of species. We were fortunate enough to have a Bengal tiger visit one of our sites one time. It was great. But if we look at our poldered landscape, it's quite different in terms of the dynamics. Instead of allowing the tides to flood the landscape, the polder has been in place. And you'll notice this is, helping keep waters out of these rice paddies and where people are living. But unfortunately, there have been some repercussions. And what we've been documenting has been the elevation deficits that are happening inside the polders. Leslie Auerbach and others have a great paper that it's essentially 1.5 meters to 2 meters of elevation loss that is happening in these polders relative to what the Sunderbans is experiencing. And then there's also a rise in our water levels that are happening out here in the tidal channels, which is essentially exacerbating our flood risk, right? If these polders should fail, the locals will be much at risk. So here's just a photo from on the ground of our land surface inside the polder. Here it is high tide outside the embankment. And you can imagine if this embankment should fail, it's catastrophic. Now the locals have realized that this is a problem. There's waterlogging and they would like to ameliorate it. So I'd like to bring to light that there's a process called tidal river management that's happening in some small regions of Bangladesh. One is an area called Bilbaina, where they are essentially breaching the embankment and allowing tidewaters and sediment to build a landscape. So Bilbaina, you can see this little beautiful crevasse splay or small delta that's built into this zone. So this is some work from some colleagues at Vanderbilt University that are documenting what's happening with the sediment supply and the elevation here. Now, Bilbaina was a great example of what worked. It was a bottom-up approach where the locals had a lot of input into where the breach would take place and also for how long they were going to keep this operational before they closed off the embankment and allowed people to return. Unfortunately, you'll see here, this is a picture of a riot going on. So there have been other TRMs, for example, in Bilkukshia that wasn't as successful. And that seemed to have more of a top-down approach where the government came in and said, hey, we're going to put this here, we're going to operate it. And essentially the locals boycotted. So I think that's worth a lot of conversations later of having input, local community input. Okay, the Mississippi River Delta, very similar processes and issues going on. This is again a DEM, a digital elevation model. The colors here are reversed. So here the reds are low-lying areas and the greens are higher in elevation. But again, most of Louisiana is very low-lying. And we also have an exacerbated problem with wetland loss in our reaches. So this map, all of these red areas are land loss that has occurred since 1932. Only the areas of green are the land gain. So it's just exacerbated in most of these coastal areas. The blue lines here are our levees in Louisiana. So those are there for hurricane storm surge protection and also for river flooding. So one of the reasons that we have this exacerbated wetland loss here is because we no longer allow the sediment to go into our Delta region. We also have put dams on the Mississippi River, so our sediment supply has been diminished as well. And then it's very controversial. Some people will say that oil and gas extraction has also exacerbated our subsidence rates. So I just want to show briefly what happened in New Orleans is another excellent case study of living on a delta and how we can try to live here sustainably. This is our levees that was put in place. There are a myriad of, or an entire suite of levees and seawalls in New Orleans to keep the waters out. The elevation has been lost significantly. And when hurricanes like Katrina in 2005 came through, Katrina was a Category 3 storm surge. Well, these storm surge barriers in Louisiana are mandated to protect to a Category 3 storm, but not above that. So actually, Katrina was a Category 5 the night before it made landfall. And essentially the storm surge that it packed was still very strong. And so obviously we had all these breaches. In fact, I was living in New Orleans at the time. I was a student at Tulane, and lucky enough, I was able to evacuate because my house took on 12 feet of water. But I think living in these areas, it's important to note that deltas are areas that we can live and we can live sustainably as long as we understand that knowledge that it's going to flood from time to time and we build accordingly. And there is a lot of sense of place that a lot of people don't want to leave where they live. So certainly there's been a lot of rebuilding efforts, but I think it's important to rebuild smarter. Being a little bit more proactive in our understanding. So in essence, building our elevations a little higher, putting our houses on stilts. This was a cartoon that came out right after Hurricane Katrina. We're essentially saying, hey, we should put all of our houses in New Orleans or Louisiana on boats. Well, that's not that far from the reality these days. Actually, in New Orleans, there are these plans to have floating houses. And a couple of them have already been built in New Orleans that essentially it's a house that's on piers that is allowed to float should water come in. So I think these are things that we should consider and keep in mind that one, we should have a proactive as opposed to a reactive response if we can. And two, start thinking about ways that we can live on this landscape that we know the processes that are happening on it. And with that, I'm going to stop and say thank you. And I'm looking forward to our discussion later.
That was great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Carol. It's interesting to see not only water as a resource and something we need to live from day to day, but also water as a hazard and a challenge to actually deal with. Our last presenter will be Dr. Joanna Dumar, and you have the floor, Joanna.
Thank you very much, David. So I'll just share my screen. So I hope you can all hear me. So so today I'll be presenting my very special or my modest work that I have been doing in Lebanon with my team for the past 8 years. So within the framework of this title, Water, a Case Study of What Works and What Doesn't. So our motivation and challenges are threats that led us to start this kind of research, especially in poorly studied areas such as Lebanon and generally in the MENA region. So because groundwater is facing tremendous stress due to both increase of water demand and the climate variability and variation. And there must be some water management measures that should be taken to mitigate, especially in our area in the MENA. So, and in order for change to happen, we need actually to gather enough evidence and enough science-supported evidence to be able to promote this change. And this is not possible in areas that are unfortunately poorly studied. So after all, we cannot manage what we don't understand. And this is the motivation of the work that I'll be showing you briefly. In general, all the case studies that we work on are pilot studies in Lebanon that we hope to upscale at the scale of the country, if possible, mostly because Lebanon is in a Mediterranean and semi-arid climatic setting where we have challenges that are greater for water sustainability. So why Mediterranean and why semi-arid? Mostly we have two problems, and this is a map of the Mediterranean basin, and this is a project that I'm involved in that is called Karma, and that looks into the water resources in the Mediterranean region based on different pilot studies from Tunisia and Spain and France and Rome. And we have two problems basically in the Mediterranean. The first one is the seasonality, where we have a problem between high flow and low flow. And as you can see in the two images, this spring is overflowing in May. If we go to September, it barely has any water in it. So this poses a problem for the sustainability of supply. Another thing that we're facing is the climatic stress, where we're having increasingly wet and dry years. And this poses, again, a problem in the sustainability of supply. So what we try to do is something I like to call from monitoring to modeling. So since some of the areas are really poorly studied, so we start at the beginning by installing a monitoring network to measure different data, to acquire high resolution data on spring and climate. And then we try to characterize the groundwater systems in order to be able to answer the questions: what would happen if a contamination would occur there, or what would happen if climate would change? And we transform these conceptual models and our understanding of these systems into numerical models, if possible, that we can hold as decision support tool to assess future shortage period and effect of climate change among others. So an example of what we do is high resolution monitoring. For instance, this is a spring in Mount Lebanon. We try to collect data. We're trying to move this into real time now. Again, this is work that we're trying to do since 8 years, and it hasn't been very, very easy. For instance, this is a time series of turbidity that is of high interest for groundwater supply, because if we have high turbidity, obviously we cannot send the water for supply, and this later can be connected to early warning system to know when to send the water and when not to do this. Also, we collect data on snow as well. We do some fancy tracer experiments in snow to see what is the reaction of a certain spring to snow melt, and how would a contaminant arrive at the spring should a contaminant occur in these vulnerable areas. We also try to implement all this in a model and try to produce some, to force the model with some climatic models with some scenarios. For instance, here with the radiative forcing 6.0, and we see what would be the effect on calibrated groundwater model. And we see how we will be facing a decrease of snow cover, for instance, and this snow cover will affect the water at the spring, and soon enough we'll be having a decrease of water resources expected, and there should be a need for finding some alternatives. So the research questions of social implications, because we want to make a change at the end of the day, and scientists are usually reluctant to translate science into or to go outside the science, but we have some implications of the work that we are doing, and most of the time we get questions from the community, such as what is the quantity of water available for supply, how resilient and vulnerable are our water resources, and what is expected should the climatic condition change. So this is where we discovered, based on a couple of projects, that we should engage the community to make the best out of it. And in that case, we start engaging the community from day one in our projects to see their feedback, what is their need and their concern, to see how to tailor the project in a way that it could have a developmental impact and help the community there. And sometimes also we need, through workshops and flyers, to remove some of the misconceptions, especially with some hot topics such as climate change or managed aquifer recharge, that the community does not necessarily adopt very easily, and they're still reluctant in doing in adopting alternatives that are not straightforward. And also it creates a symbiosis between the scientists and the community, and this will help a lot. So for instance, sometimes we are called to provide letters with scientific evidence to prevent some wells from being built in vulnerable area. This has happened like a month ago. And this is how actually change can occur in order to protect the water resources that we have, especially in this vulnerable area. Now, feedback from the community, we also start with launching webinars or workshops for our projects to also get the feedback from the community. And you can see here, we ask questions in order to see what is the concern of the community itself, from stakeholders to decision makers to even end users. And for instance, this is an example. What do you expect as an outcome from this study? And this is how we work on tailoring the project so that it has both scientific outcome and something that is very applied. So how do we involve the community? As I said, we engage them from day one. We try to do our best to engage the municipality, to engage the people, also to do some capacity training on site. So we show them how we measure in the spring, and we try to create experts from within the community, because this is what will push effectively the community to fight for their spring or for their water. And finally, I think something really, really important is to make the data available. So this is why we're working now on dashboards to translate all the data that we have and that it becomes public. And when the people see the variation of the data through time, then this is when they will be convinced of this evidence. So from science-supported evidence to change, we try to tackle these three particular topics. first to convince the community that water is a non-eternal resource, even in Lebanon. Sometimes they think, I mean, if we have plenty of water, that's not a problem. It's not equally distributed over the country. And as we said, it's not equally distributed over time as well. Also, the problem of water protection. We don't have water protection laws in Lebanon, and maybe to understand our system and see their vulnerability will push us one step further to translate this science into policy, but this is going to take a lot of time. And then the need for alternatives. So we need to find alternatives now, and these alternatives are not simply to select a dam over another option. All the alternatives should be assessed the right way to make sure that we're doing the best alternative. For instance, recently we were involved in managed aquifer recharge test site in the Bekaa Valley. And we started with it, and we did all the assessment of the well, and we're currently monitoring actually. However, the people or the community and mostly the decision maker were not very open to the idea of managed aquifer recharge, because they look at the use of water as a trade-off rather than being a synergy, and rather than keeping water from the winter time where we have a surplus to summertime. So this is when basically working with the community might not work, especially if the views of the scientists do not fall into the strategic plan of the country, and this doesn't work out very much in centralized systems. And also finally, sometimes we could have some misconceptions and cultural barrier where the community is not open or is reluctant to accepting reuse of wastewater, or even using the water from one place to reallocate it to another place. So I think that if we want to push change forward, especially in areas where we don't have a lot of data and where evidence is still yet to be figured out, the only thing we can do is to gather more evidence to create these decision tool system that we can provide to the community, and they will say for themselves, because at the end of the day, the work of the scientist is for the community because they're the end users. Thank you very much.
That was great, Joanna. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And that brings us to the end of our formal presentations, but I would like to, since we have a couple minutes, build on what Joanna had been talking about, finding how do you affect change, and how do all of us as scientists or academics or just concerned citizens, how do we affect change? We heard a lot of great work today, and the challenge is how do we translate that into change in our communities. And I agree with Joanna that there's a reluctance of a lot of people to get involved. And in my experience, I started to get involved after Hurricane Katrina, something that Carol talked about. And I've been involved ever since. And and I think the answer, working with the community is clearly important, but it's also very important to figure out who within that community can actually affect change. And Joanna was saying a little bit about that. In the US, I found that utilities, water utilities, electrical utilities, those sort of groups are interested in finding solutions and are willing to take your information and maybe enact it sooner than others. I also was really interested to hear from what Joanna mentioned about sometimes stakeholders being not interested or part of the problem or part of a solution. I've seen that a great deal. And in fact, I've seen stakeholders go from motivating a solution, being the advocates for change, to when they realize what change will actually require, being antagonists to change. So it's a dynamic and never, I think, always evolving situation, sort of like the surface of our Earth is always evolving, which makes it not dull. It's always fun. With that, I think we will enter into a time for question and answers and discussions. there are a series of questions here that we will get to. I think we'll start at the top and work our way down the questions. And I think we can, the panelists should feel free to jump in as they see appropriate to do this. The first question had to do with individual versus community level involvement in water conservation. What is the role of the individual versus the community? And what are the effectiveness of individual versus community efforts to actually conserve water? Do one of you have some insight into what the right balance of those or practices may be?
Dave, I would just like to mention that globally, I mean, this is at a larger scale. We consume 90% of our freshwater resources for irrigated agriculture, and diet is a very important thing. But I have never been very successful in convincing anybody to become vegetarian, and my kids eat more meat than anybody on the planet. So. But I mean, people need to consider, virtual water in food and diet. It can be very important. That's just one point.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. I'm going to move on to the next question. Oh, no, I'm not. Carol's going to say something.
Oh, no, sorry about that, Dave. I just want to follow up, Bridget. That was an excellent point. I had an interesting conversation with a colleague who was mentioning they were from out west, from Phoenix, and they were saying that they would return to Phoenix any day that they could. And I asked them about the water issues. I said, wow, I don't think I could live out there, because me personally, I think living in deserts is kind of an unsustainable living for humans, honestly. We're over extracting our groundwater and everything. And it came to light that they were not really aware of the water issues out there, which I thought was surprising. I mean, they knew that groundwater extraction was an issue, but then they said, oh, well, we get our water from the Colorado and it's all surface water. And I'm like, well, but it's all connected. It might be a different watershed, but you're over extracting from there. And then, whatever is happening downstream it's causing a problem. So I think part of our job maybe as scientists is, one, to help keep that community or keep that dialogue open and raise awareness of what the issues are. And certainly our predictive capabilities are very important, I think, as well, to show what the trends have been, but then also to be able to move that towards the future so that managers can really have an understanding of what to expect moving forward. Thanks.
So Carol, just want to add one point to that. Barbara Kingsolver, the author, she moved from Tucson to the Carolinas, to the humid East, because she said we have no business living in these deserts. But most people don't think that way. I mean, even, we just don't think that way. We live wherever we want, and we can engineer everything and all of that sort of thing. So I thought it was interesting that she did that and showed some integrity, which anyway.
Right, that's good. I mean, I think as humans, we have a tendency to go where there are jobs and where we can have a livelihood. And right now we've been able to, like you said, engineer solutions to living in these areas. Or I also think about the Middle East, these are very water starved areas, and places like Dubai in particular, that now they can do desalination plants. And well, right now they can do that and they can afford that, but is that sustainable for the future, moving on and moving forward? And it may not be. It's very interesting questions.
Great. I think we'll move on to the next question, and that has to do with Bangladesh. So maybe this is a question for Rob or Carol, and it has to do with water injustice. Is there obvious water injustice in the country, and can you tell us a little more about it if it is in fact there?
I think Rob might be a little better equipped to answer this, but at least from what I understand, I had some colleagues at Vanderbilt University, a woman named Laura Bennyworth, did a PhD, and essentially she was looking at water supply in the Southwest region and how much they were grabbing from surface water versus groundwater pumping versus rainwater collection apparatuses, and what different kinds of, they were trying to do manage aquifer recharge. And her, essentially, I recall from her work, she did see that there was definitely water injustice depending on economic conditions and where exactly people lived. But Rob probably has much better insight than I do.
I'm not sure about that, Carol. It's very kind of you to say so. But yeah, I mean, I think there's water injustice anywhere. I mean, if you look at Flint in Michigan and the US and the UK, anywhere, there are these injustices or inequalities that exist. And some of them are naturally occurring, and some of them we create the problems for ourselves to some degree, and they're historical. So it's difficult. I think Bangladesh, I mean, it's a fascinating country to work in just because of the complexity. You know, it's, if you would try to develop an experiment for the worst possible water situation to some degree, Bangladesh with the sort of the flooding cycles, the monsoon, you know, Carol illustrated that beautifully with her diagrams. I mean, sort of 93% of the flow goes through Bangladesh, the seasonal flooding. You know, a large part of the land is underwater for different parts of the year. The cyclonic storms come up from the Bay of Bengal. You used to have cholera above ground, so everybody went below ground. And as Bridget knows better than me, they found a lot of arsenic. So that created another set of issues. And the government's been trying to do this with a lot of partners. I mean, it's a very, very complex environment. And, you know, depending whatever you mean by injustice, it is a difficult context. They achieved the Millennium Development Goal in terms of increasing access to water supply. So they got to 98% by 2015, but that was partly through individual household investments in shallow tube wells. So these were shallow tube wells that were drawing water that was commonly having high levels of arsenic. So recently there's been a national survey, the Multi-Indicator Cluster Survey, which is still showing, you know, tens of millions of people, their main water source is heavily contaminated with arsenic. I mean, it's, you know, it's a huge problem, and the government is trying to find ways to go forward. But the work, I mean, Carol and, you know, I know Bridget works in this area as well. The sort of science helps think through what are the, you know, what are the envelopes to go forward. But they're not only engineering or geological. I mean, they're institutional and they're financial. It is a difficult context. But as we get more information, speaking to what Joanna was talking about, as we get better evidence, we should not be making the same mistakes at all. We should be improving on what we're trying to do and be accountable for that. And I think, you know, we work quite closely with the government. They are trying to work in that area, but it's a very difficult context. But it's not unique. I think in Europe and North America, you know, there are huge injustices that we see as well. So it's not just a developing country, it's a sort of political institutional factor that we need to accept of. It's not just because they're a developing country. That would be a fallacy.
That's great. Let's move on. There's a question specifically for you, Joanna, about managed aquifer recharge techniques in Lebanon, and which stakeholders or parts of the community will be involved in these different aquifer recharge techniques that are being used.
I mean, managed aquifer recharge is, I mean, there are not successful sites so far. So it was just an experimental site that we had in the Bekaa, and it's usually the aquifer recovery, so storage recovery. Generally, so we haven't tried other types of managed aquifer recharge such as check banks or diffuse recharge. So it is something that is picking up right now. The stakeholders, I mean, where we work is basically a conventional farm interested in having some environmental measures for irrigation and irrigation efficient measures, or we should say. But generally the stakeholders, if we were to use water from elsewhere to pump into the well, for instance, we need to address water authorities. And this is where I mean, if the water authorities is not convinced strategically of this to happen, for instance, if they need the water for hydropower generation, they would think that the water is lost in managed aquifer recharge, despite the fact that we're only using a little bit, like for pilot sites. And this is where, I mean, awareness is really, really important if all the stakeholders at all levels are open for discussion. So, yeah.
Great. There are a number of questions here about scale and about when we're working with water resources, you know, the individual, what should we be doing individually? What should we be mandating individually versus how large a scale do you actually need to make a difference in working a water supply? Do some of you have some interesting insight into the relative contributions of scale in terms of successful management of limited water supplies?
I mean, maybe I can just mention in the US, Dave, you know, we've been talking a lot about extremes, floods and droughts. So in Northwest US, they take about up to half a cubic kilometer from the Snake River and put it through unlined canals and managed aquifer recharge systems to store in the Snake River Plain aquifer for use during dry periods. And California has been doing that since the 60s. Arizona has been doing it. And I think we're going to see more and more of that in the future, more engineered systems to manage extremes and, you know, so, and increased resilience to expand the portfolio of options. A recent report that came out last week in Proceedings of National Academy in Jordan indicating, you know, that they needed to include desal and all of these other things to get through the next to 2100. So I think we're going to see more engineering and more management in the future. I don't know if that addresses your scale issues. Some of those are fairly large scale, but you know, Arvin Edison's been doing it and it's an irrigation system in California since the 60s. Incredible types of work with huge efforts, huge.
I'll just make a comment, not on maybe like limitations of water, but maybe on our side, it's more excess of water living in coastal regions and deltas. And in Bangladesh, when I mentioned the tidal river management, that is essentially a very small scale experiment that they did. It's maybe a 20 square kilometer area where they punched a hole in the embankment and allowed sediment to move through. And it took 10 years for that to restore that area. But there were several hundred people living in that region. And they want to scale that up to the polder scale, which is the much larger area where 50 million people live. And I've been talking with colleagues there about how much of a challenge that will be, because we're talking about a much larger area where people are living. And when they implement that, you have to basically dislocate those people and have them go somewhere else for 10 years. So their livelihood, which most of these people are living off of the land, the efforts in the Beals right now, it's manageable. They can compensate maybe a few, maybe 100 families or so. But if we're talking about the polders, we're talking about a much larger number of people and a much larger amount of their livelihood that's being taken away. So I think in Bangladesh, it's going to take a much larger scale approach, and that's probably going to come from institutions like government funding, essentially, or very large grants from World Bank. Similar to the Coastal Embankment Improvement Project that World Bank is currently funding right now. And in Louisiana, we have it's a Louisiana master plan to restore our wetlands and protect our area. And we're talking multi-billion dollars being invested for improvements of levees, for improvements of our coastline and barrier islands, and also then restoring some sediment and water to certain wetlands to ameliorate that wetland loss. So I think we're definitely going much more to a lot of engineering solutions, but that takes a lot of investment. So I think it's going to take a lot of support from the people, not just in that region. So for example, Louisiana, it's probably going to take a lot of investment and money from the US government as well.
Go ahead, Joanna.
Yes, I mean, about the scale, I think that when we talk about poorly studied areas where we don't know what we have, I think it's always good to start at a pilot scale and try to upscale it. So at the watershed level, and also this is where governance comes into play, because if we don't know really who's responsible for what, this makes even the infrastructural measures or even the management of the water a little bit difficult. So in my opinion, I mean, we can work at a strategic level and it works very well when we know what we have. But if we don't, then it's important to know the spatial distribution of the water resources to be able to reallocate in some sound ways. So I think it really depends on the regions, what scale would work.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking that as well, that there are certain countries where governance is more effective at being part of instigating a solution or a policy to work toward a solution, and others where they're less effective, and that must have a fundamental effect on what sort of projects can actually be undertaken. I'm not sure if either Joanna or Rob have seen anything like that when you compare different countries and solutions in different countries, whether the governance itself matters.
I can say something if then hand over to Joanna. I think it is interesting. I mean, some of the other countries that we work in with partners is the Central African Republic, and it's sort of characterized in different and generally unflattering terms. But there's, one of the partners with the Uptime Consortium that manages water services in rural areas for over half a million people. It's extremely impressive what they managed to do. So you can sort of say the state architecture in terms of the institutional governance might be considered weak if you looked at it externally, but you can sort of see decentralized solutions which can operate quite effectively. And then, alternatively, some government structures, create problems in the system. And it goes back to the scale question, and within the scale question, how risks and responsibilities are allocated over space and time. And I think this is the key thing: who's responsible for this and how you allocate risks. Often with a lot of the work that we're involved in with a sort of very granular local level, a lot of the risks are allocated with those least capable of managing them. And this creates some of the injustices that one of the questions came up around. So it's the institutional architecture, how you think about structuring risk and responsibility at different levels. And if you get that broadly right, you can find workable, or what some cultural theorists call messy solutions, working in quite complex environments. Joanna, do you want to add?
No, I mean, it really depends on governance, as we said, and I mean, it depends on the region. So I think I said something about it earlier. No.
Okay, we had a question. Again, it comes to scale, but this is at a really large scale, and the question is just really how interconnected are our water supplies, and can conservation in Southern Europe benefit a place like Lebanon?
Okay, so I mean, I assume this is a question for me. So what we're trying to do is actually this project that is a Mediterranean project is assessing flow in some challenging aquifers that we call karst aquifers that are, I mean, they're fractured aquifer. Bridget is very much familiar with those. So what we're trying to do is to assess how flow and transport occurs in these aquifers, and obviously in each of these regions they have different ways to manage their waters, and we're addressing the problems of pollution and early warning systems. We're addressing problems of floodwaters and storage of floodwaters. So we're looking into the different scientific outcome that would help us develop further measures to account or to better manage these karst aquifer system. And the more the merrier, because we have different pilot sites, we can actually benefit one from the other. So so that's basically why this big consortia has decided to work on these specific common problems. Yeah.
Thank you. There's a lot of discussion in the question and answer about local collection of water. Bridget talked about banking water at a grand scale, but then it was also pointed out that there are certain places, even within the US, where certain states, it's illegal to actually collect your own rainwater. And I was wondering if one of you may be able to talk about that idea of legality in terms of acting locally and actually using rainwater versus not being able to do that.
David, I know Colorado, I think the question you mentioned to Colorado not allowing rainwater collection. And I don't know if that has changed or not, but I do remember hearing that they didn't allow it. And I'm not aware of any other state that disallowed it. I don't know how widespread that issue is. And maybe, you know, it would reduce runoff and recharge in other areas. And so it may have other repercussions, but I'm not aware of any other state having those laws, and whether Colorado still has it, I'm not positive.
Yeah, I know there are many people working to remove that law. In fact, I think I too am not sure whether that has happened yet. But actually, Bridget, I did want to ask you about the banking of water and the challenges in that. I mean, it makes, in our feast and famine world of Texas, it would make a lot of sense to try to store our groundwater, but there must be real challenges to actually implementing that. Can you give us a sense of what needs to be overcome to start to get water into flooding pools where it may actually go back into aquifers?
Sure. You know, going back to the question, you know, should we live in semi-arid regions? So we were recently doing a study with Grace and other things and looking at the Mississippi, and we saw that in Mississippi Basin aquifer, they pump more groundwater out of the Mississippi for irrigation than they do in the California Central Valley. But the Grace data does not show depletion in the Mississippi embayment aquifer, because they're capturing base flow to surface water, and they've got such a dense surface water network. So I think that is really interesting. So should we be producing all our food in deserts, you know, which we have done in the past, a lot of our food in deserts in the past. So I know that wasn't your question, David, but that's something that we were looking at recently and which surprised me. Which of course was rejected by reviewers because they didn't believe it. We did visit the groundwater banking systems in California, and there's a ton of things that have to be done. I mean, some of those, they priced the water, the surface water and the groundwater, so that people would keep both systems functional, you know. So in order to be able to use surface water for irrigation or groundwater for irrigation, they priced the water so that they would keep the wells operation and all that sort of thing. In Arizona, for example, right now, where they may have to go back and the Colorado River is not reliable, and they may not get the Colorado River water, they may have to go back to groundwater, and those, they would have to drill new wells or you know, fix those up. So keeping both systems and pricing water is an important thing. And then all the infrastructure that's required, you know, it takes time to get that water underground. In these spreading basins. In California has a great geology for that. You know, you've got the coarse rocks off the mountains. We don't have that in Texas. We have a lot of fine-grained sediment, so we would have to do it through wells, and that's much more expensive. And then it takes time to bring that water back. So during drought, they have all of the wells that they can have operational, pumping 24/7, 365. And the energy costs of that, you know, So it's not going to be cheap. And but I mean, the West is fortunate in that they have a lot of irrigation infrastructure to move water around. The Murray-Darling Basin, they spent about $7 billion with precision agriculture and lining canals and everything, and forgot to take into account that that water that they thought they were losing was actually discharging to rivers. And so they were in more trouble during the following drought because they hadn't considered that. So the mantra of more crop per drop is not always right. So I think what we've seen in the US is that inefficient surface water irrigation is like managed aquifer recharge. And we've benefited from that in Northwest US with a lot of surface water irrigation. They've benefited from that from the irrigation canals in the Ganges. Alan McDonald showed from the hydrographs that they built up those aquifers in the early 1900s. And then they still haven't depleted them to levels that they had originally. So there's a lot of things to consider conceptually and how we manage things. And, you know, we always tend to go one direction or another. And, you know, we just have to be open and think about it. So I hope that maybe answers your question a little bit.
Yes, it does. And it brings me to a final question here, given our time, and that we've talked a lot about individuals and governments and communities working on solutions, but not too much about working with corporations to find solutions. Have people had experience enlisting corporations to help mitigate challenges in water supplies? And are they fundamentally different than working with governments? Perfect. The last question leaves everyone speechless. So,
well, I guess I would just comment that I've never personally worked with corporations, but at least it seems to be they're going to be in the business of making money, right? So they have fundamentally different interests. So I think probably corporations and maybe local water companies, people who are supplying water to local communities, they're looking for how can we create a steady supply, you know, so they're interested in their supply to make sure that they have a longevity for many years. And then I hope that they're not completely looking at profitability, but you know, how much money can we bleed out of people? But I think fundamentally there might be a little bit of difference in scope of what services they're providing and, you know, what their objectives are for the future. For instance, here in Baton Rouge, our local water company, we now have issues of salinization of our groundwater. So we get our water here in Baton Rouge from groundwater. And because of salinization, like over extraction, we're now getting saltwater intrusion. So our company, water company, is realizing we need to shift to surface water, getting it from the Mississippi River. So they're making plans for their future being able to supply and keep in business. So I'm assuming corporations are going to be under that same kind of thinking of what can we do to be sustainable moving forward.
I mean, David, if I can say a brief word, I mean, we have worked with corporations, and it slightly depends what you mean in this context. I mean, I think there are, you know, there's certainly horror stories of how corporates and business have behaved around sort of polluting water and misallocating water, but there's also examples of how corporations have a social license to operate. They understand that they are a social citizen, and there's a lot of people rethinking the nature of the firm. So the Cozian ideas from decades ago are being rethought in terms of what a firm is. And this brings in all the ESG, the environmental, social, and governance aspects, and the value that's being derived. So I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on, and so I don't think it's a simple conversation. We worked with a mining company in Kenya that was very, very concerned about environmental management, how they managed their water, how they shared their water. They were quite enlightened. Not all mining companies work that way, but they brought in a huge amount of investment and will leave likely a legacy of a better water situation for many of the communities that go forward. And I think you're seeing, then that's maybe not common, but you are seeing more corporates working within that context. And longer term, I don't think many corporations will survive unless they're careful in terms of their environmental and social management. And the stock markets are punishing people now quite heavily around this, and the climate agenda that's come through. Water is, as we know, the way in which the adaptation strategies come through. So I think whether they are willing or unwilling, it is coming through, and certainly a lot of global companies have to do it, and a lot of national companies. There's a lot more work to be done, but I think it's a very, very interesting area, and one that certainly needs looking at.
Well, on that very encouraging note, at least I find it very encouraging, and I agree. I want to thank all of our panelists for our presentations today. It was really enlightening to hear these back to back. And I also want to now turn it over to William Hoffman, who will provide some closing remarks. But thank you very much.
Thank you, David. And on behalf of all of us in the 2COAC team, thanks to all of you who have participated broadly, joined us for this dialogue on the climate crisis. Some of you joined just one session, some of you joined all three. And I think it's worth noting that we're ending our series of 3 seminars today, just the day before Earth Day, which celebrates the birth of the modern environmental movement. If you would like to view any of the seminars that you've missed, or review those in which you participated even, you can go to a website on the American University of Beirut's Global Engagement site. And you're seeing now, I think, something on that. You'll find there the recordings of the 2 seminars that we've had so far, but there will be this seminar up in short order as well. And the address to get to that, I think, is being put up in the chat box as well. You'll find that address. I also want to thank all of our panelists in all 3 sessions for a very good dialogue that helped us put together. And the co-sponsors of this online series do our thanks. This is the AUB Global Engagement Initiative, which is directed by Rami Khoury, and also AUB Center for American Studies and Research, which is directed by Robert Myers, and he's been ably assisted by Iman Al-Kaisi. And we owe our thanks to the AUB New York Dev Center Communications team, which has been directed by Allison Freeland, and to Dennis Villa, the IT manager, as well as a very able graphics team that assists us at AUB in Beirut. And of course, to all of our own team members from Duke, Earth, and the University of Texas at Austin and AUB. We have touched on 3 rather different themes. We have talked in our first seminar about power relationships and social injustice and how they've contributed to global warming and how they need to be addressed to achieve collective action to mitigate it. In our second session, we talked about the storytelling power and shared narratives, the role that these have in our understanding of the present and imagining our future, and hence the important role that they play in motivating us to break established harmful patterns in the interest of a more sustainable planet. And then, of course, finally today, we've had a close examination of that irreplaceable resource water, what we might wisely do and avoid doing to try to reset the natural balance. There are, of course, many other themes that we could have pursued in these series of seminars, but time limited us, and climate change does, after all, impact virtually everything under the sun, and we can't cover it all. Our intention wasn't to cover the whole waterfront. Our goals were rather, one, we wanted to emphasize that there are barriers to climate change action that aren't only technological, but also societal, cultural, economic, and political. It's a complex situation, and it takes a whole system approach to deal with it. It takes a multidisciplinary approach to diagnose the root causes of climate change in action and to develop some strategies which will move societies to act. And doing that calls on us to take a deep dive look at beliefs, attitudes, and values. A second goal we had in this series was to drive home the point that addressing the climate crisis requires collective action. And I would underscore both collective and action. We're all in it together, and it's going to take our acting together to get out of the soup that we've created and found ourselves in. So understanding the problem isn't enough. We have to act. The third goal of our series was to contribute to the dialogue among regions, cultures, and communities across Global South and Global North. It's pretty clear that one size doesn't fit all in different places, different peoples, different experiences that have climate change impacts and barriers to action that vary from place to place. And what works in one place isn't going to work in some others. On the world stage, there's long been this tension between the wealthy North that's largely created the greenhouse gas problem over the past century and a half, and the less technologically advanced South is being asked to tamp down its energy consumption before it can catch up with the North. So it's only through dialogue that we can resolve these tensions. And cross-cultural cooperation also offers the prospect of seeing old patterns in a new light and hopefully leading to better solutions. Our fourth goal in this series was to foster a model for climate crisis leadership and build a network of people with the knowledge and drive to accelerate collective action. This is a goal that we really haven't talked about explicitly during the seminars, but it's been woven in to what we've been doing in these three seminars. We who have put these seminars together don't think we have all the answers, but we do hope we've stimulated you to join us in searching for new ways to be effective in achieving collective action. Addressing the climate crisis is a community process, and the answers of how to reverse global warming will need to be tailored to each community by its own members. Transformational change, innovation, and new ways of seeing the world and our place in it will be the hallmarks of any successful effort to address it. Of necessity, these entail collaborative undertakings, and therefore they require a leadership style that encourages cross-fertilization and inspires input from many quarters. We encourage you to build communities in ways that give people a sense of belonging and trust that their contributions are needed and make a difference. These seminars are the first of two COACTS initiatives. We'll take what we learn in conducting these, and with your valuable feedback, we'll plan our next steps, and we'll keep you apprised. Meanwhile, we urge you to marshal your special talents and become climate leaders in your own communities, in your own organizations. We believe each of you can shape your organizations and your community's cultures and ways of doing things, and you can drive change that moves the world a little closer to reversing global warming. We urge you to do so. The changes you help generate will expand outward like ripples on the water from your own neighborhoods and organizations to the community of nations as a whole. And your leadership skills will grow with practice. Leaders are not born, they are made, and they're made by practicing leadership. So we close with a challenge. Go forth into the world and change it. Thanks again for being with us.